I'm John Foulkes, Microsoft Business Manager, joined by Jack Lewis, one of our senior technical architects. Both Jack and I are very much focused in terms of Microsoft. My focus is more on licensing and commercials, working with our customers in terms of those aspects of Microsoft, how you transact the licensing. Jack is more focused in terms of technical capability, something of a guru and really an evangelist, the art of the possible, really. Quick hello from you, Jack.
Yep, good morning, everybody. Good morning, John.
Good morning to you, Jack. So, without further ado, this session, it's actually Jack and I delivering a series of 3 webinars. So this is number 2 in the series of 3. Some of you may have joined our previous session, the first webinar. That was more focused across the modern Microsoft stack in terms of E5 and what E5 capability gives a customer, the value in E5 across Office 365, EMNS and Windows. Today we're focused really more on security and particularly post-breach security tools. So the sense that in the modern world, IT has certainly changed, and how IT is managed has certainly changed with the prevalence of cloud services, Office 365, SaaS applications, and how they are managed is very different to a traditional approach methodology in terms of traditional IT management, and what Microsoft offer in terms of delivering that. So certainly Microsoft is focused in terms of productivity with Office 365, but there's a key focus here from Microsoft as well in terms of securing that productivity, both the access to and securing breach and what happens should a breach occur, and actually mitigating and limiting the extent of that breach should it occur. So if I can just go through quickly agenda items. So what we're focused on today, Jack and I, key areas of the intelligent security graph from Microsoft. This underpins really global telemetry that Microsoft can use and customers can act on in terms of security profiles, breach that happens, and this is developed and made available globally to customers. Unlike any other vendor, really, Microsoft has a position here that's unique. And in terms of products, Azure Identity Protection, Azure ATP, Advanced Threat Protection, and also Windows Defender ATP. These are key product areas that support the proposition here. Fundamentally, in terms of licensing, these are either Plan 2 or E5 in terms of where they sit within the suite. We'll come on to that later and perhaps touch on a little bit of licensing and pricing towards the end of the session. Okay, so in terms of Microsoft's mission, a bold statement, empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. In some ways, I think it echoes Bill Gates' statement back in the, I guess, late 70s, early 80s, to see a PC on every desk and in every home. And I think Microsoft has certainly had bold visions through the time as an organization, and no less now, I guess, with that mission statement. So certainly, a global focus, productivity-led, but wrapped around that productivity, security, and that's really become prevalent. And I guess, if we look at Microsoft maybe 5-6 years ago, that element of the Microsoft proposition wasn't as strong as it is today. Jack, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think the important area of focus here is that in order to empower people, Microsoft are promoting the use of cloud services, and cloud services need to be secured and managed using different technologies, using intelligent security. So that is what we'll be focusing on for the rest of the webinar. But I think it's important just to remind organizations that this is Microsoft's mission. They are a company that is essentially selling productivity. But when you move your data to the cloud service in order to be more productive, you obviously need to think about security as well.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And in terms of what underpins here, and this is the slide here, Microsoft 365, this is the modern desktop licensing construct, essentially, and in terms of what that enterprises in terms of pillars, Office 365, and this is the element that everybody really is familiar with, most familiar with, is the productivity stack, and typically that is E3 or E5. Certainly when we look at enterprise customers, yes, we do have E1 and also F1, which was kiosk previously, and a mix of these is absolutely possible, but central to this is productivity. But wrapped around here is EM&S, enterprise mobility and security, again essentially in two flavors, E3 or E5. Again, as I said earlier, the focus here is really E5 capability or Plan 2 capability that you see within that stack. And underpinning that in terms of desktop operating system, Windows 10, and when we look at Windows 10 or Windows E5 in terms of versioning rather than E3 delivers, again, the level of security and post-breach analysis with Defender ATP. But again, you'll see us reference these, and again, as customers working with Softcat in terms of any quotes you see in terms of Microsoft licensing, a lot of this comes back to M365 or Microsoft 365, which is Microsoft's current branding and terminology. So yes, that includes Office 365, the productivity, central productivity suite, but wraps in these other very key elements, EM&S in terms of security, identity management, document controls, and device and application management, as well as underpinning the modern desktop in Windows 10. Okay, I've made a slight reference to this earlier in my intro, but classic IT versus modern IT. And Jack, would you mind if I hand to you just in terms of perhaps giving a perspective
absolutely.
on this, if you would?
Yeah, so these are Microsoft terminologies for classic ID being the way that we have always, the way that we've managed devices, or the methodology that we have managed users and devices and the access to their services over the last 15 years, which provides levels of control above and beyond perhaps what some organizations need, but also isn't very cost effective. So Microsoft are now focused on this new way of delivering compute, apps, services, and the management of those to their end users by the modern IT approach. So if we look at going back to the mission statement, which is to empower organizations and people to achieve more, the modern IT approach allows end users to work from either their own device or a corporate-owned device from anywhere. It aligns to accessing services that are available from anywhere on any device via SaaS applications or externally facing applications, and those need to be secured and managed using different methodologies. And the analogy or the advice that I always give to customers is, if your organization is looking to gain efficiencies in both cost and agility, so looking to promote a more agile way of working, the modern IT approach is the way that we would recommend they align to. But it doesn't mean that you sacrifice control. So what you gain in efficiencies, you sacrifice in control, because you would use things like a mobile device management tool to manage devices rather than perhaps System Center Configuration Manager and group policies. And I think the important thing to keep in mind here is in the modern IT approach to delivering those services, you may not own that device. So as an IT organization, you have to accept that devices may connect to your services that are infected by malware or perhaps are suboptimally configured. So that's why Microsoft have built these intelligent security solutions, which we're going to discuss today, to identify when attacks take place and make IT organizations aware of that, and then in certain cases, depending on the maturity level of the product, actually go out there and automatically remediate those issues. So I think this is an important concept for organizations to understand, and it is very much Microsoft terminology, but classic IT being take a device out of the box, re-image it, join it to the on-premises domain, manage it using group policy and configuration manager, which is how we've always done things, but it's not very cost effective, versus modern IT where we don't really differentiate between who the device owner is. We just target policies at users. They can then work from the device that they want to work from, so they can be productive, so we're empowering them, but we do sacrifice control. So I think that's just an important concept to understand here. And if you are going to align to that modern IT approach as an organization, these post-breach security controls are absolutely, are going to be absolutely required.
Yes. Thank you, Jack. So I'm just going to move the slide on to the intelligent security graph. Jack, if you want to just...
Do you want me to cover this one?
If you wouldn't mind,
yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, this slide is completely plagiarized from Microsoft, but I think it actually displays exactly what the intelligence security graph is. If we just talk about the intelligence security graph for a second here before we move on, this underpins all of Microsoft's security offerings. So the intelligence security graph contains signals and data from all of the cloud services that Microsoft provide and puts them in a very unique position. They are the, if not one of the largest identity providers in the world. They process, as it says at the bottom there, nearly 500 billion monthly authentication and access requests, which allows them to build huge spectrums of data to perform analysis against and look for patterns of attack. So they use machine learning algorithms. They use cloud scale levels of data to actually build intelligence into the security solutions. They also feed in signals from all of the emails that are received via Office 365 and all of the files that are accessed. One of the things that we'll touch on later when we talk about Defender ATP and the integration levels with the intelligence security graph, if a threat is spotted on a device and it's identified via a Defender ATP, because the security solutions share information and they learn from each other, if that same attack is then transmitted via email, Office ATP will then be able to prevent it from hitting your endpoints. So this is an important concept to understand when you start to utilize the Microsoft 365 intelligence security services, and it does underpin every single one of those security services. Brilliant. So let's.
Yeah.
I think it's probably time to talk about some of the products that actually use that intelligence security graph. So if we start with Azure Active Directory Identity Protection and what that is, we did cover this very briefly in the last webinar, but essentially this is part of Azure Active Directory Premium P2. And if we just roll back a second before we discuss exactly what this is, I think we need to just make just confirm exactly what problem it's trying to solve. So when you move your data and services to the cloud, you can't put a firewall around those services. So the keys to the kingdom are the identity, essentially. And if that identity is compromised and that service is accessible from anywhere on any device, you could have a major problem on your hands there. So in order to prevent or solve the problem with passwords, i.e. they get stolen, they get reused, people write them down, et cetera, organizations have implemented additional verification controls such as multi-factor authentication to solve that problem. And from a security perspective, that absolutely does solve the problem in most instances. So even if your password is stolen, you would still need to provide that second factor of authentication or the additional verification method that is required in order to access that service. The problem with that approach is you then end up with a multi-factor auth problem where it breaks the end user experience. So this was designed first and foremost to solve that issue. Essentially what it does is it profiles your end users and learns what is normal behavior. If something anomalous then occurs, there is a risk score tied to the identity and to the session. You can then do something called risk-based conditional access. Now, if we just talk about conditional access for a second, conditional access is essentially the engine of control that you would use in the Microsoft world to grant access to services. So, for example, you can say, if John is trying to access Office 365 outside of the office on a non-corporate device, so it isn't enrolled in MDM or it's not domain joined, he must do a multi-factor authentication. With this, you can add that additional level of control or additional level of intelligence, to say rather than forcing the multi-factor auth, only ask for the multi-factor authentication if the session appears to be risky or there's some sort of risk associated with that identity. And over time, it will learn that if John logs in from a device at home, it will learn that that is normal behavior for John. You've probably seen this kind of behavior if you use the Hotmail service from a personal account or any kind of Microsoft services with a Microsoft account rather than an organizational account, particularly if you're using passwordless sign-in, so you've got the Microsoft Authenticator app. If you sign in from an unknown location or a location where it hasn't seen you before, it will ask you to do the FIDO authentication via the fingerprint on the phone or the PIN code, but then it will also ask you to enter a number that appears on the screen. So it's that kind of intelligence that it's building in. It also, utilizing the data that is in the intelligence security graph, they're feeding data from the digital crimes unit into that, so they track malicious IP ranges, stolen credentials. If you as an organization share a hash of your passwords, or if you've got cloud provisioned identities, Microsoft will check whether your passwords, your usernames and passwords are for sale on the black market or they are in that stolen credential database, and if they are, it will force your end users to change them. So that is the kind of the post breach, I guess, here. This is more of a, out of the three solutions that we'll talk about today, this is the least post breach, but we felt it was important to cover the identities from a cloud perspective as well as on-premises, which is the next one.
Jack, I've just seen that we've got a question in the chat box from Ian, who says, I'd like to hear more about that comment. With modern IT, you lose an element of control. I think this is going back to the previous slide when you talked about the intelligent security graph, Jack. Yeah,
so the typical areas that you would lose control because you are using mobile device management tools to manage Windows 10 devices versus Configuration Manager is it can be difficult or sometimes impossible to micromanage that device from a configuration perspective. So if you want to set individual registry keys, that's either difficult or impossible. Additionally, complex applications typically, depending on what MDM you use, can be either difficult or impossible to install. So in the world of Config Manager and group policy, we are kind of used to setting individual registry keys to whatever we want them to be. In the world of MDM, perhaps that isn't possible. And it depends on individual scenarios, but you do lose elements of control there. Also within Intune right now, I don't know whether this is going to come in the near future, you cannot differentiate between personally owned and corporate owned Windows devices. So you cannot say you can only enroll corporate devices. There are ways around that which essentially break the modern IT approach, which the National Cybersecurity Centre have released some guidance on. But if you take the Intune approach with iOS and Android, you can say you are only allowed to enroll the corporate device, so then you can list IMEI numbers and serial numbers, whereas in the Windows world, you cannot do that yet. So there are levels of control that you lose.
Okay, Ian, I hope that answers your question. And again, if we've got any questions, happy that we try and field them through the dialogue box, the chat box as we go into the Q&A. Okay, so just moving on in terms of just a little bit more here on identity protection from Azure Active Directory, isn't there?
So focusing on the post-breach side of things here, because this is both a pre- and a post-breach solution, absolutely. There is vulnerability management in there. So as I've touched on, if your passwords are in that stolen credential database, it will make you aware. It can also make you aware of the users in your organization that aren't registered for multi-factor authentication. So you can force them next time they sign into Office 365. And then in terms of implementation, we just touched on this very briefly. It is really simple. Typically, the way to enable this is to go to the Azure portal. You opt in via the Azure Marketplace. You then assign the licenses to your identities. At that point, it will begin profiling their usage. It will learn over time what is normal behavior. And then you would create the conditional access policies to take into account risk rather than just location or device or whatever it might be that you want to use to add that layer of intelligence in. And one of the things I did want to mention as well, at launch, which was about a year and a half ago, maybe slightly longer, this didn't work with ADFS, but it now does. So that's just something to make, I just wanted to make the guys on the webinar aware of here.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good point to raise, isn't it, Jack, actually, that integration. Good. Okay. So moving on, in terms of Azure ATP, and this is relatively new, sits within EM and SE5. Incidentally, Microsoft haven't increased the price of that suite, EM and SE5, but it is, it's ATP as a cloud-based service rather than on-prem, isn't it, Jack?
Yeah, I find this one really interesting actually because within Enterprise Mobility and Security E3, you get a service called, or you are granted access to a service called Microsoft Advanced Threat Analytics. This is essentially that in the cloud. And there's a couple of advantages to that approach. I think we should probably first talk about what Azure ATP does. It is essentially identification of attackers when they are inside your network. So you configure port mirroring or you install an endpoint on your domain controllers and you feed all of the authentication and access traffic into either Microsoft Advanced Threat Analytics if you're using the on-premises version or Azure ATP if you are using the cloud version. And it will look for anomalous behavior inside of your network and look to identify known attacks based on the reconnaissance lateral movement cycle or persistence cycle. So this is very much a when we align to that modern IT approach, if we've got end users bringing their own device into our network, and they are accessing services such as file services on premises, and there's some sort of anomalous behavior there, or whether it's a domain joined device and there's some sort of anomalous behavior there, this will make you aware of it. It won't necessarily go out there and do anything about it. This is very much a visibility and identification tool rather than a proactive, let's go and fix this tool. So there's no automatic remediation within ATP. But one of the really cool things about Azure ATP and Defender ATP, which we'll talk about later, they actually share information via the intelligent security graph. So if you are seeing anomalous behavior on identities, i.e. it looks like there's some sort of risky behavior, i.e. it's identified some reconnaissance work or some sort of known past the hash, past the ticket style attack taking place, and you look at Defender ATP and there are some risky PowerShell commands being run or some sort of known privileged escalation type attacks taking place, you can correlate between the two and isolate endpoints using Defender ATP. So it's about making you aware that if you as an organization are aligned to that modern IT approach and you accept that regardless of how many pre-breach security solutions are purchased, it's likely that somebody is going to get through, this will make you aware when those attacks are taking place and allow you as an IT organization to then go out there and do something about it. I think one of the things that we did want to make organizations where I talked about port mirroring there, typically the way to configure Azure ATP because it's cloud-based, the typical way of actually configuring that is to actually install an endpoint on domain controllers. So that can be difficult to get past change requests for a lot of large organizations, but it's just something to be aware of there. And then just moving through the additional information that John's clicked through here, a couple of recent updates. Obviously, the service was marked as generally available, I think it was about a month ago. So this was in private preview until recently. The on-premises equivalent has been around for a little while now. And I think one of the things I didn't touch on as well about the on-premises equivalent, a lot of organizations are licensed for Microsoft Advanced Threat Analytics, which is the on-premises equivalent of this. But we never saw a huge amount of customers actually deploy the on-premises version. Typically, this was related to the resource requirements. It required a frightening amount of CPU resource, storage resource, memory resource. You were typically looking at physical service to actually power this. So one of the clever things that Azure ATP has done is it solved that resource issue by offloading that to the cloud. So yeah, just moving through the recent updates, there are, even since the release, which was less than a month ago, there are new attack types that Azure ATP is able to identify. I'd certainly encourage the security ops guys on this call to check out that blog. It just talks about the type of attacks that it's able to identify and how it does that. And there's also support for multi-forest scenarios. So for organizations that have that, multiple Active Directory forests, it does require 2 ATP workspaces, but it is a scenario that is supported. And if we just look at the supported operating systems workloads, you're looking at Windows Server because it's domain controllers. You can also, if your VPN supports Radius, it's able to capture that traffic as well. So that just makes the actual protection capabilities more fully featured. You can feed in logs from your SIEM solution. You can also feed information into the SIEM solution as well. So it's bi-directional via the SIEM solution. And you can also configure Windows event forwarding, although I think that's probably going to be the least of the least popular of the onboarding capabilities here. So typically the enrollment process is to install that endpoint on your domain controllers and then configure the update settings because that endpoint will need updating from time to time. And the graphic in the bottom right of the screen, guys, talks about the typical attack cycle and the amount of time that each of those takes place. The orange and the red is where Azure ATP would look to identify those attacks. So if you look at the lateral movement initially, that could take weeks, but in order to actually take over your entire domain, that can take months for that to process typically. So it's important that you've got these tools in place to identify those types of attacks. And as John said, if you've got the E5 license, there's no uplift cost there, so they haven't increased the cost as of yet. Whether that's to come, I'm not too sure. Sorry, you are entitled to that service.
Yes, yeah. So it's been dropped into EM and SE5, isn't it? as Jack says, at no additional cost.
And there's also a way of purchasing this standalone, right, John? If organisations didn't want to go down the EMN-SE5 route for whatever reason.
Point, it is available standalone as well. So again, don't feel that you've got to go EMN-SE5. However, again, and we can work with specific customer examples here, there is merit in certainly looking at the uplift to EMN-SE3 to EMN-SE5 for the additional capability you get in terms of P2 services for Azure AD Premium, Azure Information Protection, and as well as Cloud App Security as well, which features within EMN-SE5. But yes, absolutely. The basic standard procedure here is that these elements are available as components, but you can quickly cost justify the suite, and the same goes across the stack of M365. But again, very happy to take this on an individual basis as a follow-up where customers want to look at perhaps costings and some benchmarking and cost analysis.
Yep, spot on.
Yeah. Should we move on to Windows Defender ATP, Jack?
Yeah, so I think this is probably going to cover the bulk of the content, to be fair. So Windows Defender ATP is essentially Microsoft's advanced anti-malware solution. So when this was first released about a year and a half ago again, it was part of Windows 10 Enterprise E5, and it was essentially just a cloud-powered EDR solution. So it was able to identify, again, similar to Azure ATP, that attacks were taking place against your endpoints, or there was some sort of anomalous or risky behavior on your endpoints, but it wasn't actively able to do anything about it in any sort of automated fashion. So the capabilities have grown over time, and we'll talk about the recent updates over the next couple of slides. But essentially, this is I would describe this as, I think John will probably agree here, quite a disruptive technology in the market.
Yes. Yeah.
We speak to our security and networking team here at Softcat, and it's a similar kind of, or it could certainly replace something like a Cylance or a Carbon Black, something along those lines. And the advantages of this, particularly when you align to that modern IT approach, are within Windows 10, it is part of the operating system. So if you align to that modern IT approach and some of the security vendors don't particularly align well with per-user models that we've seen throughout the past. I know that they're changing slowly over time, but obviously this is purchased on a per-user basis, and it's pretty simple or very simple to configure via your MDM, whether that's Watch, Intune, or whatever it might be, and Configuration Manager. Because it's part of the operating system, you simply feed it with information about what tenant ID you belong to, tell it how much data you want to send, and then you will start to see endpoints reporting back into the Defender ATP portal. And I think one of the great things that it does, which is a recent addition, is that it assigns risk scores to endpoints. You're then able to actually act upon that risk score that is assigned to that endpoint. So we talked about doing risk-based conditional access at the identity level. We can now do that at the device level as well. So if you use Defender ATP, if that device has a risk score of medium, we could require them to go via Cloud App Security and proxy the session into Office 365 so that they can perhaps access services, do their email, access their emails, send emails, receive emails via the Outlook web app, but we wouldn't allow them to download any content until the threats are remediated on that machine. And of course, if the risk is high, you probably want to block access to services as well. And on the right-hand side here, I'm not sure how clear the screenshot is to everybody on the call, but essentially that is a screenshot of the portal that the Defender ATP is managed from. So it's a cloud-based portal. You feed in your telemetry data, and then Microsoft will provide you with the insights into device risk. There's also threat intelligence there as well. So it will make you aware how, so for example, how many of your devices are protected against the Intel chipset attacks that we've seen recently. Have they got the correct updates on?
So this is pre-breach as well as post-breach, isn't it, in terms of what the technology can do?
Very much so. It was originally very much so just a post-breach technology, John. So when it just did the EDR capabilities, it would identify that something anomalous is occurring on your devices or a single device. But right now, as of the latest update, you can now perform automated actions. So Microsoft described this as SecOps engineer delivered via artificial intelligence. So you can take automated, fully automated actions or semi-automated actions where it will tell you what it's going to do, and you've still got to approve that as a SecOps engineer.
Good.
And I think the next slide, again, plagiarized from one of our Microsoft P-Seller entitlement here, perfectly covers what Defender ATP is capable of. So you've got the attack surface reduction where it will recommend that you you align to certain configurations. That also sits alongside the security posture via the integration with the Microsoft Secure Score, which I'm sure people on this call have probably seen the Office 365 security score. There's also the Windows security score now, where it will take data from Defender ATP and recommend that you turn services on to improve your security posture. There's the next generation protection, which is included as part of the operating system. So that is the Defender antivirus, anti-malware capabilities. EDR, which is feeding the telemetry data and using those machine learning algorithms and cloud data sets to analyze your endpoint for anomalous behavior and risky behavior. The auto investigation and remediation is what we've touched on. Again, SecOps delivered via AI. And then one of the new capabilities is the advanced hunting, which essentially allows you to build very granular queries to look for attacks that have taken place or some sort of anomalous behavior. And Microsoft is building relatively complex queries into the library within, what's the terminology I'm looking for here? It'll come to me in a second. Place where you store the scripts. Mine's gone blank, it'll come to me in a second. But essentially you can download the scripts or the pre-built queries to get you going so that you can build more complex queries yourself and look for specific file types or any kind of attack that's taken place there. Yeah, so just moving through Defender ATP, recent updates, and these are well documented on the internet by the various Microsoft blogs. So there's automated investigations, which is a huge step forward for this service. It takes it just from post-breach to potentially, I wouldn't describe it as pre-breach, but it certainly will go out there and actually automatically remediate those issues on your device where possible. We've touched on conditional access based on device risk. That's certainly very useful to organizations. It does require that in-tune integration because that's based on compliance policies rather than the typical conditional access controls that you would see kind of implemented in two separate areas versus Azure AD, identity protection. Got the advanced hunting, which we've touched on, the Secure Score integration, which a lot of the customers that I speak to absolutely love the Office 365 Secure Score. This takes it a step further by actually taking into account how secure your endpoints are. And there's also Power BI integration, so you can expose all of the data that is in your Defender ATP tenant via Power BI. And some pre-built workspaces there as well. In terms of supported operating systems, this does shock a lot of our customers. Windows 10 is obviously supported, the server operating system supported, and also as of about, I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, they now support Windows 7 and Windows 8.1. Now, Microsoft described this as, we're not looking to make Windows 7 and Windows 8.1 more secure. You should still be looking to move away from those, but it can help during that transition period. And it is just the EDR capabilities. So it's just going to identify that there's some risky behavior on that Windows 7 device or that Windows 8.1 device. There is also the ability to feed in information from macOS, Linux, iOS, and Android devices via third-party integration. So I think this is really cool. If your organization is using Lookout, which is very popular for threat analysis, threat intelligence on iOS and Android devices, or Bitdefender or Ziften or Sentinel-1, you can feed that data via a cloud connector into the Defender ATP portal to give you a better insights across your estate. So it's not just limited to those Windows 10 devices, which is really cool. That's how it started live. It's the capabilities are growing as the kind of 6-month feature updates come out. And in terms of enrollment, I think we've touched on this, but it's super simple. Initially, we'd recommend that you use the built-in script for testing maybe 10, 15, however many pilot devices you want to do. But then enrollment en masse is delivered either via config manager, which you'll need current branch for if you want to make your life easy. It's very simple to do. It uses configuration items and configuration baselines, but puts a nice interface in front of that, or MDMs, which are, again, super simple. Drop your tenant ID in, tell it how much data you want to send, and away you go. There's also support for VDI non-persistent desktops via a script. And one thing to keep in mind here, if you've got those third-party integrations via Lookout, Bitdefender, Zifton, SentinelOne, you may need to purchase additional licensing from those vendors to enable that service. That's just something to keep in mind there. And John, one of the questions I've been asked a couple of times, particularly around the server side of things, obviously this can only be purchased via Windows 10 Enterprise E5. How does that work from a server perspective? My answer has always been it kind of works a little bit like a CAL. You would really, well, you'd ideally license all of your users for Defender ATP via Windows 10 Enterprise E5 using the per-user model. But if you only got a subset licensed, that could get a little bit messy if you start protecting servers, I guess.
Yes, agree. So certainly the Windows E5 Defender ATP is a client-side only licensing. So it is the client. As we've been saying through the course of the session, per user is now the prevailing model. Yes, per device licensing is available as well. Per device, this is essentially the Windows upgrade with software assurance, but the E5 variant rather than the E3 variant. So again, yeah, if you are delivering non-persistent desktops via VDI, for example, that still requires client licensing. And what's important here is the active software assurance within the suite, within the M365 suite. Essentially, you've got that on a per-user basis for Windows E5 or indeed Windows E3 if you choose not to take Defender ATP. And that's the fundamental difference at a Windows level between E3 and E5 is specifically what Jack's outlining here, the Defender ATP service.
Yeah, there's literally one difference, isn't there? I know they call it the E5 equivalent, but it is just that Defender ATP entitlement.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Okay, so just thank you, Jack. Just to wrap up, and for once, I suspect we may even actually run to time rather than running over. But just a quick little bit of context in terms of pricing, to just give a little bit of an idea of what the cost is of the services that we've been describing through the webinar. Pricing here is essentially RRP, monthly RRP. Volume discounts are, of course, available depending on customer size and volume, of course. But in terms of Azure AD Premium Plan 2, £6.80 per user per month. Azure ATP at £4.20, and that as a standalone service, or of course, as we were saying, that appears in EM&S E5 at £11.20, and then the Windows 10, Windows Enterprise E5 at £16.70. These are all per user per month, ex VAT prices. Absolutely, as I mentioned earlier, we appreciate we've got a range of customers licensing in different ways, enterprise agreement, MPSA, CSP as the prevailing models. Very happy as a follow-up to look at specific scenarios, given what we've discussed today, and take that as a follow-up. Please contact via the usual channels via your Softcat account manager.
Brilliant. And we've got a question from Stephen, actually, in the Q&A, which I think is a really good question, actually. So he has asked about one of the challenges that his organisation faces is with organisational levers, and if they're connecting to 365 or other SaaS applications and downloading corporate data onto their personal device, how do they protect against that once that person leaves? So, Stephen, it's a slightly different set of products within Microsoft that would provide the levels of protection I think you need here. So first of all, we'd be looking at cloud app security that could do some proxying, where you could provide limited access to services if they're coming in from a personal device versus a corporate device. So that would be one product that we're more than happy to pick this up offline and do demos of and show you the capabilities of that. Secondly, there's Azure Information Protection, which is able to provide file-level encryption and rights management and file classification to data. So regardless of where that data resides, the protection levels are persistent. So if that end user leaves the organization and you disable their account or change the password, depending on how you've got the ARP templates configured or the RMS templates configured, they would no longer have access to that data. There's also a final technology which is part of Windows 10, called Windows Information Protection, which you can use to identify where your corporate data resides, and if that corporate data is copied down to Windows endpoints, it is encrypted using an encrypting file system, and you can perform selective wipes using tools like Intune. And we're more than happy to do demos of those technologies for you if you want to get in touch with the Softcat account manager.
Yeah, absolutely. I echo that. Really happy that we look at these on a one-to-one basis in more detail.
Yeah, and that applies to anybody on the webinar as well. If there's any technologies that you require some more in-depth discussions about, whether it's anything we've discussed on here or anything within M365, just feel free to get in touch with the Softcat account manager, and myself and John will pick that up.
Fantastic. We are just about on time, maybe a minute over. That's a bit of a record for Jack and I, actually, not to overrun. But I guess unless there are no more questions through the dialogue box, through the chat box, then we'll close the session.